So let's be honest, Hollywood action films are a dime a dozen, but every so often a film comes along that just changes the game. I think the John Wick franchise really pushed the boundaries of the genre and I think like redefined what a modern action film can be. But with the mainline series seemingly concluding with 2023's John Wick Chapter 4, there seems to be a John Wick-sized void that needs to be filled, which brings us to Ballerina, a spin-off tasked with continuing the series while also establishing its own identity. Does it live up to the lofty reputation of the series, or is it merely another case of Hollywood refusing to let a good thing die? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So I will cut right to the chase and say that I think for the most part, this film succeeds because I enjoyed this film for what it is. I think Ballerina is largely a series of action sequences in want of a plot, but I think Ana de Armas proves capable of carrying the baton into the future, and the bombastic action remains entertaining, even if the unrelenting death and desensitizing violence does feel overbearing by the end. And for audiences, at least of a certain age, I think actor Keanu Reeves will probably always be synonymous with Neo from the Matrix movies, but his role as John Wick has become, I think, equally as iconic and has propelled him into a late career resurgence. And Keanu Reeves may not be the most gifted actor in the world, but he is a very perfect John Wick. And therefore, I think the success or the failure of Ballerina hinges in large part on sort of passing the torch to Ana de Armas. And after cutting her teeth in a supporting role in the latest James Bond film, No Time to Die, she proves herself capable of handling an action star role. Now granted, a John Wick film doesn't necessarily require much refined thespian acting skills, but I think despite lacking some of the same this imposing screen presence as Reeves, I do think she manages to hold her own with the physicality demanded by the role. And I think what also helps the spinoff, to step at least 1 foot outside of John Wick's daunting shadow is that it doesn't attempt to establish her just as a female John Wick, kind of in the same sort of lazy gender swapping gimmick that Hollywood has been guilty of in the past, because she is her own unique character who just happens to exist in the same shared world as the prior films. And during one of her initial training sessions, one of her women instructors encourages her to fight like a girl. But thankfully, anyone worried that this film will unfold in the mold of, a stereotypical feminist girl boss type thing can breathe easy. Because yes, she eventually, goes on to dispatch waves of enemies some sort of video game set on easy mode. But she also takes her bumps and bruises. And I just felt that her growth and her combat skills all feel earned rather than just sort of forced upon her. And I think she also just demonstrates an interesting degree of emotion and vulnerability that the John Wick character, for the most part, lacked. And I will also say that when she is eventually confronted by the actual John Wick, the film leaves no ambiguity who remains atop the food chain. But of course, I think few people watch a John Wick movie for an intellectually stimulating plot. They just want to see bullets fly. And really the extent of the plot in Ballerina is mostly just the logistical necessity to transport de Armas from one extended action sequence to the next. And there are some flashbacks and I think seeds of interesting moral dilemmas, but the film is just too busy staging bloodbaths to ever really follow those threads. And the original John Wick films definitely begged the question of how much is too much when it came to the non-stop action, but often managed to avoid just the monotony of it by staging what I think to be some of the best action choreography ever put to film, where that long take kind of dollhouse view sequence from the last film still lives rent-free inside of my brain. I think Ballerina has its own satisfying action moments, but overall it does lack, I think, some of the sophistication of the later John Wick films. And I think the problem is that there are just only so many ways that you can film an assassin gunning down wave after wave of bad guys. And Ballerina, I think, struggles to inject many fresh ideas into that formula. Really, the one exception here is a very thrilling action sequence involving a flamethrower, which I think is awesome and is sure to be like this film's most like memorable moment. But beyond that, it does begin to feel like this film is staging the same action sequence multiple times, only swapping out like the geographical background to like differentiate them. Like the action is still stylish and I think well choreographed, but it just feels very familiar, almost like this series is on autopilot. And as like the death count just soars to obscene levels, it quickly becomes desensitizing as well. Because like the first time a villain is brutally hit in the face with a sharp object, it's a moment of effectively shocking violence, but like by the fifth or sixth time that something like that happens, it feels almost more like a tired party trick. And I'll be totally honest that like I found myself several times in this film kind of eager for a lengthy action sequence to finally wrap up so the film could get back to like the story, which is probably not something that anyone wants to be thinking during a John Wick movie. As far as content I consider, things going on the surface of this, as you might expect, there is plenty of content to go around. For language, I counted somewhere between like 10 and 15 F words, as well as just a scattering of other more minor profanities. And I think like the names of Jesus and God are each used, I think, at least once. For violence, as should be expected for a film that fills its 2-hour runtime with nonstop action, there is plenty of death and like bloody carnage to be had, because the death count exceeds triple digits, with many of these bad guys dispatched in very like over the top violent ways, because you have characters shot in like all parts of the body or like hit in the face with sharp or blunt objects. You have characters torched with a flamethrower, like blown to bits with a grenade. Although I will say that like the camera never like lingers on the aftermath of that violence, usually beyond just sort of quick splatters of blood. And lastly, for sexuality, there's nothing going on like in that department in this film. As far as themes, worldview, things are going on beneath the surface. There's always been kind of an unavoidable tension at the heart of the John Wick franchise that I just find really interesting. And that is that the film largely serves on a platter to audiences the same mentality of like vengeance and violence that the characters like in the film itself seek to escape from. And I think that same sort of thematic tension exists in this film as well. Because like the urgent counsel for Eve, which is De Armas's character, to leave like, a violent lifestyle behind does ring a little bit hollow when like the violent carnage all looks so stylish and like entertaining. But I think in a sense, that is kind of the whole point. I think like the audience, like the characters in the film, find an almost like guilty pleasure in like the satisfaction of like carnal desires and like violent justice. I think we probably shouldn't be like as entertained by such desensitizing violence and carnage, and yet perhaps the fact that we are exposes some of the truth about our human nature. And as with like earlier films in the series, the theme has a very like overtly biblical dimension, because when Eve sort of seeks knowledge about the men who murdered her father as a child, with the intention of seeking vengeance upon them, a man remarks like such a need for forbidden knowledge is what got us banished from the Garden of Eden. And I think more than like just being a throwaway line, that quote becomes kind of this film's thematic through line. And that like the central character in this film is named Eve, I think hammers home that connection even further, because a woman named Eve, ignoring prudent warnings in order to take matters into her own hands, only to find herself trapped in a cycle of death, is a plot summary that I think as easily describes the book of Genesis as much as it does this film. And the film's primary villain is a cult leader called the Chancellor, and he's obsessed with like the idea of fate. Because he declares, that people like Eve don't make choices, but rather they are chosen. I think if he's sort of the devil on Eve's one shoulder, then John Wick maybe represents like the angel on the other. Because he, in several moments throughout this film, urges her that like the front door is unlocked and that she still does have the power to like choose a different life, but whatever her choice ultimately is, her actions will have consequences. And I think in a way, both characters are actually somewhat validated, because when Eve questions John Wick, why he's not taking his own advice, he counters, "I'm working on it." And I think like, ultimately, beneath the surface of all this stylish, spectacle and violence, these are very tragic characters, kind of led by their own sinful human nature into an endless cycle of violence. And this film, as with like the John Wick series as a whole, just shows characters fighting to break out of that cycle, but ultimately demonstrates just the futility of doing so on their own power, almost like implicitly pointing towards God through his absence in the John Wick world. So, in the end, I think Ballerina should satisfy action junkies just looking for another dose of like brutal action. I think, unlike many of Hollywood's other attempts to pass the baton of like an iconic franchise, Anna de Armas actually makes a convincing case to carry this franchise forward. I think had Ballerina released like a decade ago, it may well have like established itself as like a game changer in the action genre, but it is instead releasing in 2025 in the wake of like four superior John Wick films, and some of those like just unfavorable comparisons are hard to ignore. I think Ballerina is a solid action film, but one that hints that perhaps like the genre-shaking John Wick series is now itself in danger of becoming the stagnant template in need of new life. But hey, I would love to hear what you guys think. If you guys enjoyed this movie, if you think it lives up to the the reputation of the series, or maybe you think this series is running out of steam, don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't listened to, encourage you guys subscribe to the channel, become a Collider. Got lots of other movie reviews. Got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast. Got interviews. Just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. Most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with the world for Christ.